The first question is for you, Mrs. Miller. It asks, what is the cost of a IGCC with CCS? So you know what those acronyms mean, and I don't. So if you could answer those, please.
That's a clean coal plant that actually captures and sequesters the carbon. Currently, Future Gen Illinois is asking for stimulus funding in the form of grants. We're asking for stimulus funding in the form of a loan. So that tells you one way quickly that there's a difference. And the reason that we're asking for a loan and not cash is because for them to capture the carbon and store it long term and measure and monitor it for 1,000 years, which is the environmental standard to make sure it stays in the ground, they're estimating that 74% of the cost of their $1.87 billion plant has to be in the form of taxpayer money. We, on the other hand, have a $1.6 billion plant, and we'd like to get the money in the 80% in the form of a loan and pay it back over time. And the big difference between the two is that if you do the carbon capture and sequestration just to store it forever and monitor it, obviously that's a lot more expensive than if you use it and sell the CO2 for EOR, and then after the well is depleted, you let the CO2 stay down there and you do the measuring and the monitoring and the verifying at that point. So there's a huge difference. The plants like this that get built in oil areas, I believe, will be the best plants in terms of commercial viability, and there's a lot of demand for CO2, as you all know, so quite a few plants can be built. But if they're built outside the Permian Basin, southeastern New Mexico, places that have oil fields, it's going to be very, very expensive, much more expensive.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Miller. Next question is, what are the advantages to carbon credit buyers? Are they allowed to emit more CTGG if they buy more credits? How does that regulate? And what happens when everyone regulates the emittance, leaving no carbon credit buyers?
Well, if you have a power plant, you know, an old coal-fired power plant, and you don't have sort of easy, low-hanging fruit that you could pick, if you like, to reduce emissions, then you could choose to buy credits instead. So the advantage, if you like, is that you get to stay in business, I guess. But obviously that has a significant impact on your cost per kilowatt hour, and it will impact your position on the dispatch curve. And so you'll make the economic trade-offs that make sense, and in essence that is the point, right? Is it's put a price on carbon, and then everyone, a whole bunch of smart people will get their calculators out and figure out what they should do.
Okay, thank you. And I've just been told we only have time for one more question, so this would be for Dr. Fine. Dr. Fine, do you favor a carbon tax or carbon cap and trade, since carbon cap and trade is fertile ground for abuse and a huge bureaucracy? To support it, how would it be imported?
That's a good question, because carbon cap and trade is somewhat unpopular for a different reason, and that is the sense of what happened in Wall Street with investment banks seem to extend now in the public mind. Should cap and trade go to Wall Street, Chicago, to the firms that have also been responsible for mortgage-backed securities and so forth? Should they have another revenue stream and all the bonuses and so on? And that's a good point about cap and trade. So I think what is going to follow will be that cap and trade will be regulated, and I think my view is that it should not reflect the excessive derivative trading. In other words, the leverage trading that took place in oil and gas should be essentially regulated out. And if we get a cap and trade system, it should not be one where there are models and leveraged against banks and there's excessive volatility in the price of carbon. Senator Bingaman earlier on has a safety valve, which I think is one of the admirable parts, where the government will step in if there's volatility on the upside and start an expansion of allowances to head off speculation in carbon trading. There are many mechanisms, regulation, the safety valve, and so on. But my view is that that platform for carbon trading should not go the way last year in terms of the futures markets and derivatives market. It should be carefully regulated. Now, I'll add one more thing to Bernanke's problems. I would suggest to the central bank, the Fed, because it's climate, that the Federal Reserve should have monitoring and regulatory power over climate in terms of cap and trade. Thank you.
Mrs. Miller, Dr. Fine, Mr. Hudson, we want to thank you again for being here this morning and for sharing your thoughts and your insight with us. Let's give them another hand, please.